Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Stephen Phillips, and this is the Cal Poly LA Metro program in Architecture and Urban Design. And we run a lecture series as part of our school here in Los Angeles, our campus program. And we've gone online for obvious reasons. And our usual environment is the Helms District Design Center. So we'd love to usually invite them to introduce their environment, which you'll see, and then we'll get back to introducing Ariel. So Angela Anthony, of course, she runs the events and planning over there at the Helms District Design Center in on the bakery in Culver City. So Angela, all you.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. Hi, Ariel. Nice to meet you. And behind me, you'll see the background is the Helms Design Center. So that's where we normally are for these events. That's a previous Cal Poly event. It's a really beautiful 1931 landmark historic building. It used to be an actual working bakery. And now it's a collection of showrooms and design center with to-the-trade showrooms inside the space that you're looking at. And we love hosting Cal Poly. It's one of our favorite events. Stephen and I have been doing this together for several years now. And I'm sad that we can't see you all in person, but that will come back eventually. And I just wanted to welcome you and thank you all for being here. Thanks, Ariel, for being here as well and joining us. And I'm going to give it back to Stephen. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Angela. We're excited to have a very fun lecture tonight. We usually go back east as part of our annual field trip with the students. You can see in the gallery, but this year we couldn't go. And we love to go to MIT. It's one of our favorite places. And my favorite lab, of course, is City Science, which Ariel Noyman works at, and also gives us the benefit of incredible tours while we're there. Anyway, we're really excited and always find the work that they're doing fascinating and very contemporary, and probably extremely relevant today in terms of the techniques that they have to offer. So we're super excited by that. So just for those of you who don't know, Cal Poly LA Metro is part of Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. The campus, the main campus is fairly large school, actually. We are part of the fourth year off-campus program here in Los Angeles, where our students are taught studio design. They intern in about 25 different offices in the city. We have fellowship programs for them as well. And they also have practice classes and theory classes, and some of our faculty are with us tonight. I think I saw Pavel Getov out there in the gallery, and maybe Teddy Slowick is often here too. I would like to give a quick shout out to our varied sponsors who support our fellowships, scholarships, and our events. Of course, Helms Bakery District, as well as HMC Architects, Morphosis Architects, Geary and Partners, AC Martin, Co-Architects, Marmol Radziner, Theater DNA, Boltaup, Arc Document Solutions, and our media sponsors, LA AIA, Arcanact, has always been really gracious, and of course, KCRW DNA. So tonight's lecture is, of course, by Ariel Noyman. He's titled it City Scope from Smart Cities to Street Knowledge. Ariel Noyman is a PhD candidate at the MIT City Science Group, and he's a lecturer at Northeastern University, an architect and urban designer working to fuse cities and technology. His research is on novel methods of urban modeling and simulation, future mobility, and decentralized public participation. In recent years, Noyman coordinated and deployed a worldwide network of city science living labs in Boston, Hamburg, Shanghai, Andorra, and Helsinki, to name a few, in an effort to confront his group's work with real-world challenges. His work received awards from the European Commission, the OECD, the Israeli government, was featured by The Guardian, 60 Minutes, The New York Times, and was displayed in exhibitions, conferences, and summits worldwide. Noyman holds a Master of Science from MIT and a Bachelor's in Architecture cum laude from B-Cell Academy in Jerusalem. So please join me in welcoming Ariel Noyman. Ariel?
Thank you, Stephen. It's a wonderful introduction, and definitely not the way at least I would imagine us to eventually meet. I love your trips to my lab. It's one of my favorite moments of the year. So let me quickly share my screen. We can start with that. Let me know if you see that here. Okay. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can. All good.
Okay. So, as I said, that's definitely not the way I wanted to meet you and the students and have that talk handled, but nothing is normal now. And in the spirit of that, I would love for us to maybe try and have this more as a conversation, if possible, than kind of a full-blown traditional lecture. Well, a couple of reasons. One, it's 8:30 in the East Coast, and as you can probably hear by now, English is my second language, and in 8:30 p.m. it's dropping down to be my seventh. So there is a good chance I'm going to lose track at some point. And also, really, I am going to cover a lot of topics and a lot of subjects my group and my lab is engaged with, and I want you to be open to conversation and ask questions. So I'm going to have a few stops during the talk, and Stephen, you feel free to coordinate them however you feel like in terms of questioning and comments. This talk is nothing about me or myself. I'm not going to talk about the work I've done personally. Everything that you see here today is about work done with a great team of researchers, of designers, of scientists from all over the world that I have the privilege to work with. But I do want to start very quickly with at least the path I personally took in the past 2 years to sort of show you how I sort of transitioned from very traditional, I would say, architecture background to what I'm currently doing. So I'm starting here. This is one of my favorite places in Tel Aviv. You're all more than welcome to visit as soon as the world resumes. It's a beautiful place. And I had the privilege, despite being in a very small country with a very small design industry, the privilege to work on some high-end projects straight out of school. We did things like the Ordus 100, if you're familiar with that, a project that was curated by Ai Weiwei and Herzog de Meuron in China. Some museums, the Tel Aviv City Museum and the renovation of the Israeli Museum in Jerusalem. The background you all selected here, which is the Museum of Tolerance as well in Jerusalem, the project that was dropped by Gary and eventually was picked by us in an international competition done with Hayutin Architects. And several other institutional projects, many competitions. You know, this field is all about losing as many competitions as you can. So that was a big part of the work I've been conducting. But there was a certain moment somewhere along the lines of 2013, 2014, when I felt that the profession, to some degree, tiny bit lost the way, or at least lost the way for me, or the motivations that brought me to love architecture and sort of want to engage in architecture. I felt that sort of those questions that at least triggered my interests, which is about how the city operates and how people use the city, were kind of neglected, and there was a lot of emphasis and a lot of discussion around how the buildings might look like, you know, how the geometries might operate, how you know, it might be Instagrammable or not so much about those traditional questions that at least brought me to the profession and made me very interested about that. At the time, I was a master's student at MIT, so like many other students, and it's a very common practice there, you start at one place and you end up in a different place in the campus. So I wandered around. I met a lot of researchers and scientists and professors and had a lot of conversation and eventually stumbled upon the Media Lab. And later I learned that the Media Lab liked to kind of dubbed itself as the Salon de Refusés, which I guess not all of you are speaking French, but this is translating into the place of the unwanted, where the misfits go, where people who couldn't find themselves in any other traditional discipline eventually drop and do things a bit differently. And just as a few examples, and that's not a substitute to a real tour at the Media Lab, but the e-ink that you might be familiar with, that you probably have in your Amazon Kindle devices, was invented there. Professor Hugh Hare, who is creating and actually using the most sophisticated prosthetic legs in the world, is working there on fascinating work on replacing human parts with prosthetic robotic legs. These guys who somewhere in the 80s went to a ski trip, recorded their trip to that ski resort and came back to the lab, created a simple software which became to be Google Street View as we know it today. The Guitar Hero, how many of you have a Guitar Hero? Some. Guitar Hero was invented there. And this is, you know, it's a toy and it's a game and it's kind of a beautiful technology, but I think the emphasis here is about thinking about human-computer interaction in a very different way. Not anymore the keyboard and the mouse that we use every day, but a different way to interact with those technologies. And lastly, those fine-looking gentlemen who are wearing computers, but in a way they are professing to a future in which we will all have a computer on our bodies, which is definitely what happens today, right? And you all have a supercomputer in your pockets. Some of you have it on your wrists. Some of you might have it on your eyes at a certain point. So this is, again, kind of this anti-disciplinary approach to research. This type of research, this approach yields about 27, 28 different research groups. Each one of them is a whole world by itself. But among them, there is a city science group, which is our laboratory. And we're trying to focus on a simple question. What is the future? What is next for our cities? And usually when I show that introduction, the immediate response is, oh, okay, guys, so you're doing smart cities, right? You're in a technological place, you're at MIT, you work on cities, so probably you are in the marriage of technology and cities, that's smart cities. And at this point, I usually try to take the conversation one step back and ask, what are cities? And I think we all have maybe a similar, but not exactly the same definition, because, you know, we define cities as the endless suburbs of Beijing or the favelas of Rio de Janeiro or the industrial American city or the beautiful grid by Cerda, and they all fall under the same category. It's a very broad category, almost abused category. So maybe with your permission, just a very, very quick introduction to at least what we call cities. So every city starts like this. You have a certain geographical function or amenity that allow life. In this case, it's water. In other cases, it's security. If we go to 3,000 years BC, this is the city of Marais on the outskirts of the Euphrates. And the city is built on the verge of a prehistoric infrastructure, if you want. This water body feeds the city, cleans the city, feeds the agriculture. And around that, you have this perfect circular development that regardless of where you go around the world, the same era, you would find very similar models. Many different cities, they almost all share the same form, the same structure. And since you're all great students of Stephen, you probably know that the DNA that ties all of these cities together is our DNA, right? It's our ability to move a certain distance before we get tired. That's simple as that. So when we don't have a car, when we don't have any other mode of mobility, we are defining those boundaries of the cities. And that definition, known as the Marchetti constant, is about 40 minutes to an hour every day. So this is a very famous paper by Marchetti, who then became the Marchetti constant of human mobility. And what is very interesting about this paper, which I recommend to every urbanist, every architect to read, is that doesn't matter which mobility mode we have in our disposal, we will always move the same amount of time every day to work and back. And this is fascinating because that defines the development of all cities around the world. In fact, if we look at some of the cities that got developed to what we know today, so this is Paris, the old Paris, and this is the modern Paris. In the middle, you can see that dark line defining the historical core. The development pattern of Paris around that center is exactly the same as that city of Marais. So each one of those new quarters, the 15, the 16 quarters, all of those places you go to visit Paris today, is effectively one small city of Marais. And when we map out the functions and amenities in those small cities, you can see a beautiful distribution, almost an equal distribution of all the functions, because it's not one centralized city, it's many small cities that are working together. But Paris is an outlier. Barcelona is another outlier. Most cities up until the 19th century indeed developed that way, but then we see a series of technological disruption that shift that course of development of cities. So the first industrial revolution brings a lot of pollution, also pandemics, and basically pushed away the residents of those cities outside of the city centers, which was greatly supported by the second industrial revolution with the car. So the post-war, veterans coming back from Europe, seeing the devastation of cities in Europe, basically deciding to move away from city centers and using the car to eventually create this new typology, which is the suburb. And what is the suburb in this context? It's the promise of regaining the quality of life that we lost in those city centers in the form of a half-acre, fake grass, fake swimming pool, and 2 cars, so we can always go back to the city to get whatever we need. And when we do go back to the city, this is usually how we do it. I think this is from your city, this is from LA. A common afternoon, you can add to those 20 lanes, maybe 20 more, it doesn't matter. They will still be actually created the new hybrid in which we have the density of urban cities, of kind of the desired urbanism density that we might want, but we're still heavily reliant on the car because the mix of usages doesn't exist there. So we're still traveling quite a lot. And going back to the first question, so usually these are the smart cities. You take a 3rd, 4th tier city, you inject some technology, some smart grids and some sensors, and voila, you've got a smart city. But probably this is not the city that we all aspire to live in or to work in. So this is for us sort of the starting point for research. What is next for our cities, considering that this is the type of that we need to face today. Now I'm going to go very quickly through the first 2 research topics that my team is working on, sort of show you the whole picture of how we work, and then dwell a bit more on the third one. And Stephen, feel free to stop me with questions whenever they come along. I don't see anything beyond my own slides now. Okay. So the first research topic is mobility on demand. And as we talked about, probably the best way for us to move in the city is through our legs or using maybe bicycles if possible. But as we know, cities are not developed that way. Most of our urban environments are developed in a very different form. So in the past 20 years or so, our team is developing a whole slew of developments of vehicles that are supposed to solve that first mile, last mile problem of movement in the city. So not to solve the entire trip from the suburb to your working place in the center of town, but solve those connections where transit doesn't exist, when transportation is not served properly. I'm not going to go through all of them. I just want to show you the latest one we are working on. So one of the things we were starting to look into in the past few years, maybe 5-6 years, is the sprawling of bike sharing systems, the development of bike networks, and also the usage of bikes for not only moving people, but also moving goods and deliveries in the city. And that resulted with the PEV project, that stands for Persuasive Electric Vehicle, a 2-mode autonomous tricycle, electric shared tricycle that can, from one end, carry packages and goods in the city, and from the other end, carry people in a shared mobility system. It's a very lightweight autonomous tricycle, so it's not a car. And kind of moving from renderings to reality, this is a PV traveling autonomously on the bike planes around MIT. And you can see that the whole movement is very slow. We're talking about something like 14, 15 miles per hour. We're not competing with a Tesla, but we're not intended to compete with a Tesla, because in a second, you're going to see a car passing by. Okay, so I don't know if the video runs well enough, but that car that passes on a 90 miles per hour will stop eventually at a certain point, and on average, those two vehicles will move in the city at the same speed, because the speed by which we move in the city is about 15, 16 miles per hour. It doesn't matter which car you have. So that's sort of an alternative way of moving in urban environments. And we're using a lot of off-the-shelf technologies for building that. Again, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of autonomy, but instead of reinvent, I think, a new category. And I think, Stephen, you mentioned the labs we're building. So this is a lab ran in Taipei by our team. This project is actually led by Michael Lean from our group. And in Taipei, they're building those vehicles and testing them in real life. So you can see here two of them traveling on a bike lane, and this individual in a second, you will see, tries to see whether the PV will run him over or not. Happily, that didn't happen. But this is really what's important about that. It's not important to test them inside the lab. We need to take them out and test them in real life. So the team is working quite hard in many different places around the world to test them and examine different models and different types. And just recently, in collaboration with a car company in Southeast Asia, they've developed a PV model which looks almost as an off-the-shelf product, if you want. And you can see the whole sequence here from start to an end. So the girl is ordering one of the PVs through an Uber-like or a Lyft-like app. But then, unlike those mobility modes, she's actually pedaling. So there is activity involved here. She's also charging the PV. Now then, if she wants the PV to follow her for any kind of reason, for deliveries or security, that is also possible. And one important thing, and I mentioned that before, is the human-computer interaction. So you've seen the eyes sort of follow the ways she looks. It's less relevant while she's driving, of course, but it's super relevant when the PV is robot that is traveling by itself in the street. Right, so you saw the acknowledgement moment of the PV. I saw you, you can cross, everything is fine. So we're currently building that. And again, this is not necessarily something you might buy tomorrow morning on Amazon, but it's really a kind of a new thought about a new category of mobility. Stephen, I can go on, or we can have questions to this moment.
I think with the kind of format, it's easier with the if you just continue and then we have a long Q&A, only because the animations create glitches. Everything we do might create a glitch, and so it's just, yeah, if you're okay with it, just even if you finish early, then we'll just ask questions and we can talk about the different things that you've done and things.
Absolutely.
Okay.
We're all hanging on a thread here.
Yeah. Plus also only one person can talk at a time. So it does, yeah, just go. Thanks.
Okay, absolutely. So we'll have water sips every once in a while though. But that was the first research topic that we conduct. And the second one is rounding around the question of rethinking the home and the working place in the city. And again, that goes back to the idea that if we go back to cities, we probably will have to let go of those, lavish half-acre or more houses that we're familiar with in the suburb. So a few years ago, a few of our students, led by Khasier Lara here in this video, were developing a project called MIT City Home, in which they were basically building a robotic architecture system that allowed to take 20 square meters or 200 square foot apartment and make it livable as if it's a 500 or 600 square foot. And everything you see here actually was operating, besides the water functions. And two students actually lived there, and that was built in the Media Lab building itself. And you can see all the different amenities and functions, about 6 or 7 different configurations. And that gained a lot of traction to the point that in 2016, the team spun off a company now called Ori. and kind of going from, you know, the academy to real life. This is from one of their latest commercials. You can see an Airbnb apartment in Boston that was fitted with the ORI system. And again, with a click of a button, the whole system is moving. Full-blown living room is being created. And when you think about it, we don't use most of our spaces throughout the day, so it makes very little sense to keep them empty if we can actually recreate that space through the robotic architecture solution. Just recently, they were well invested by Sidewalk Alphabet, and that allows them to start thinking about a different scale. So not anymore just the housing, but working places, leisure places, restaurants, amenities, stores, everything that could be refitted and reused makes a lot of sense when you think about living densely in urban environments. But although they went to do their own project outside of the lab, this work continues with a different, with some different projects. We look into retrofitting hospitality spaces. We think about reconfigurable working spaces with this autonomous robotic wall that you see over there in the city. Basically, sorry. Okay. We look back into what we have learned from the city and what happened in the city. And we started doing that, again, a few years ago by simply building simple Lego models, no projections, no data, nothing but just colorful Legos. And we realized very quickly that this medium is a very easy and very comfortable medium to create this collaboration. The people that you see here are not architects, they're not planners. Some of them are business school students, some of them are engineers. And we found that using that medium, we could very easily create a conversation around urban environments or around the built environment. But we also quickly realized that this medium is easy to model, given the pixelization of the lab or the simplicity of the model. We can then take this information forward and create some insights modeling. So we started with simple things like satellite views, land uses, the mobility systems, solar potential of the area, what is the wind regime of the urban environment. And then we started looking into a bit less conventional data layers, like where the money is situated in the city. So this is where the startups and the venture capital around MIT. And you can see that the dark areas are federal buildings and the MIT buildings themselves. And wherever you have light and color, that's where the VCs are. We then started looking into what we generally call the urban dynamics. It's how people behave and move within the city and how we can use new technologies to do that. This is already 6 or 7 years ago, but we took tweets, geotag tweets, and we looked into which tweets appear where and how they all come together within the built environment. But this is partial. Tweets can only get you so far. There are not a lot of geotag tweets, and they're pretty hard to parse and use. So in the last few years, we started looking into a collaboration with the city-state of Andorra, a tiny city-state in between Spain and France, about 70 or 80,000 residents at all. But Andorra, despite or beyond being just a very beautiful place, also holds a few interesting points in terms of its position in Europe. One is that they have just one telecom company, and this allows an interesting insight into basically every device that ever stepped into the country. Now, at this point, it's needless to say, all the data that we have gained is completely anonymized. We don't know who these people are, or where they come from, or what they do, what their names are, or even the phone number itself. And you can see how noisy the data is when we don't parse it. But as soon as we start and kind of use some algorithms on the data, we can start and understand the behavioral patterns of where the French go, where the Spanish go, where the Andorrans go, where do they stay, how much time they might spend in each one of these locations, which amenities are more used and which are less, and eventually also which are the mobility decisions that they might take and where congestion might happen. And this is not just your Google Maps congestion. This could be also pedestrian congestion, which occurs every time you have a big event such as Tour de France or Cirque du Soleil in the country. So this is very important for decision makers to understand. But insights can only take you sort of backwards. You can only look into what already happened in the city. What we're truly interested in is sort of predicting forward, is looking into what the future or the what if of the future might hold for the urban environment. And so one of the first project we did in terms of predicting forward was a project, again, in Andorra. But this time we ask ourselves, what is the key elements, what are the KPIs that makes a successful urban place? And I think that, you know, as urbanists, as planners, as architects, this is a very, very important question for us, because these two pictures, these two images are from Barcelona, almost the same hour of the day, only about 300 or 400 meters apart. One was built by one of the greatest architects of the 20th century, with billions of or millions of euros invested in, completely empty. And the other one, I don't know when was the last time somebody cleaned the street, but completely packed and very much used. And something happens that brings people here instead of bringing them to the other one. So we set ourselves back to look into those telecom data and location data that we mentioned before, this time with a higher resolution and with greater accuracy. So we can actually start and track what we call stay events. And stay events are every time somebody stays for a certain period of time in the same location, we tag that moment and then we calculate how much time they spend. So this is the vertical lines would be how much time they spent. Horizontal would be moving from one stay to the other. So it's not everybody in the city, it's just those who stayed. If we do a cross-section of that behavior over 24 hours, I think you can start and see with the naked eye some clusters, some moments where more and more people stay at the same location. And this was an interesting moment because then we realized we can take these clusters and we can potentially merge them with the urban amenities that we have in the city. So where the hotels are, where the restaurants are, natural landscapes. When we put one on top of the other, we're using some machine learning algorithms, you can start and have a correlation or a correlative model that can explain the relationship between the two. So we take those amenities, those functions, and we superimpose those stay events and clusters. So this is the results of our model. So you can see a prediction of where a higher potential for people to stay exists in the city. Of course, the center is very clear. There is a moment there, it's very, very high, but there are also other peaks around the city, which with the correlation of different amenities, different functions like food and education and others, you might create an active cluster. And just to sort of show you an example, we found that education functions like schools are a big deterrent for the creation of a cluster in a public space. I don't know why, we don't have the explanation, it's not a causality model, but we do see that education versus religion, for example, is creating this, this deterrent. And this becomes a valuable insight and a prediction for a decision maker in the city, in this case, of course, Andorra, but in many other cities as well, where they can use that for their decision making. So we don't leave those models and those predictions on the screen. We take them and we build them into our Cityscope interactive platform. So in 2017, we build a city science living lab in the city state of Andorra, La Vella, which is really in the center of the country. And as you can see, this platform is there physically set up for decision makers and the public and the users to come together and have a conversation around those topics. Currently, they've started work on the context of the corona, and they're also using these models for this purpose, but this is too early to talk about. But I want to give you a few more examples of how we do predictions using this platform. So a different question that we set ourselves up to explore was around the way we move in the city and how our urban form or urban distribution affects our movement. So this correlation is very well known in the research. We know that there is a lot of correlation between the mobility mode choice and the way we live. If we live in a suburb, there is a very low chance we're gonna go to work by foot or by bicycle. If we live in a dense urban area, there is a higher chance that we're gonna take the public transportation or walk or bike. But it's not that easy to show this correlation, especially to show this correlation in real time and how it might affect or change considering changes to the city. So this project was this question and was trying to show how changes to a very, very small portion of the city might affect the mobility choice behavior of the entire region of Boston. So you can see on the bottom right side, the users interacting with this platform, changing very small portions of the city. Each one of those bricks is about 12 square meters. But on the left side, you can see how that might affect the entire mobility mode choices for the region of Boston. And the reason is very simple. There is a second and third order effect of everything we do in the city. And I think, again, going back to what you guys are doing, us as architects, as planners, we usually tend to crop our drawings and our models to a certain degree and say, you know, this is the constraints in which I'm acting. This is where I build my building or build my neighborhood. But we need to understand that the resonating effect of everything we do is much larger than that. In this case, it's mobility, but in other cases, it could be many other things. So that was sort of the purpose of this project, and I think it's a sort of a good takeout from this work, how we can see the resonating effect of our development. A different approach to predicting things in the city is known as discrete modeling, which in this case is based model we built for the city of Hamburg. The term agent-based is quite simply, you don't model the entire city system, you just model specific individual agents in the city and try to see how they emerge together into a certain behavior. The idea here was to see how we can control the behavior of people coming in and out from the Hamburg port, one of the biggest ports in Europe, as well as their behavior in the public transportation system, the train station, etc. Again, very slight moves, very small changes, but we wanted to show how that might resonate as a bigger effect. And very, very recently, we literally finished this project a week ago. We have worked in a collaboration with PCA Stream, a Parisian architecture office, on the redevelopment of the Champs-Élysées, maybe potentially the most important boulevard in the world. And our goal in this project, our part, was to build an agent-based model that would predict how those changes to the landscape and to the environment might affect the behavior of pedestrians, of bikers, of commuters in that area. Now, we did all that work and we deployed a beautiful exhibition in March, led by Arnaud Grignard from my team, in Paris, in Pavilion l'Arsenal. But unfortunately, the world had different plans, so we had to shift the whole exhibition into an online version, and we just deployed that last week. So if you guys want to visit that and give us your impressions, we would love to see your clicks there. And maybe last project in terms of prediction is maybe a different type of prediction or a different approach to predicting things. So one of the things, at least for me as a, as a designer, as a planner, that I'm always concerned about is how the city might look like, pure visually, especially when we do master planning and when we do urban design in large scale. It's very hard to predict that in the long run. And this takes a page from the famous Kevin Lynch work from the 1960s, the view from the road and the image of the city, in which Kevin Lynch was trying to profess to the future planners, his students, that we should not look at the city as an agglomeration of small objects that each one of them is individually has its own role, but we actually have to see the city as a holistic view. So if you look at this image on the right, for Lynch, there is no fence separated from the road sign, separated from that tower. This whole notion is one singular entity, which is the image of the city. And therefore our imageability of the city has to be taken in that context. And it's very different from how at least planners of his time were thinking. And I think that what can, when you read through Lynch's work, you realize that he was basically trying to tell us, when you do that, you should think about that. And it's very hard. It's a very complex effort. How do you move from master planning or zoning or very preliminary design to the understanding of the effects on the actual street? So using more modern technologies that we have today, more specifically generative adversarial networks, we're building a cityscope that this time would allow users to just play with land uses and have the system produce a real-time visualization of how the street might look like. And more specifically, more concretely, this would be a design session. You can see the users here just playing with very crude land uses. But at the same time, the model is trying to predict how that street view might look like, considering an agglomeration of those different land uses. Now, again, as an architect, somebody who spent mostly nights rendering streets and buildings, this is sort of I think a new approach or something that I would like to see as a new tool set in the future design world. So not anymore this very granular, slow motion process in which we plan the city and then we plan a street and then we plan a building and then we render the building and we go through that, but something that can actually help us imitate those elements from the get-go. So we talked about insights and predictions, and these are great to understand and potentially predict the city, but what we really need to do is to test what-if scenarios. That is to test how the city was and how we want it to be. So the first, at least for me, the first interaction with Cityscope was a project in which I was looking into how changes to our urban zoning and regulation might affect the built form. So I guess it's a diverse crowd. So to those of you who are less familiar, zoning and regulations are an imminent, fundamental part of how cities are. They started somewhere at the turn of the century with the need to distinguish between functions that were hurting the city, like factories next to a school, and pollution, and all those mixed uses that weren't supposed to be there and were mostly the cause of the first industrial revolution. But then with the transition to the second decade of the 20th century, they started also creating form-based zoning. So what you're seeing here, these are on the top, the Hugh Ferry's famous drawings of the 1916 zoning book from New York. And on the bottom part, you see New York, and it's quite clear that what he was drawing was the language of the law in 3D, but on the bottom, it's a complete and direct representation of the law in the actual buildings. But zoning also became very complex. So these are 3 moments in the zoning books of the city of Los Angeles. Try to do anything in 2011 and you'll find it pretty complex. So this project set itself up to try and simplify this process. Instead of looking at the code, at the zoning code, and then constructing the building, can we invert that process? Can we create a process in which we design whatever we need and then the code fits itself to our needs? So the first part, and maybe the longest one in this process, was to go through the code. And I've never read so many legal documents, and I hope I will never read them again. But that was necessary because what we needed to do is to convert those legal language into something that imitates an algorithm or imitates a computational system. And when we're done with that, we build a cityscope that allows users to do exactly what I mentioned. So you can see the architecture, design, whatever they feel like as designing, and then the system reactively tells them whether they're breaking or following the rules. And this kind of a feedback system, feedback loop, although it sounds maybe very rational and maybe very obvious, doesn't exist. The way you design today is by reading a lot, doing some drafts, then getting a new input from your lawyer or from the city, and then you have to change your drafts, etc. This was supposed to streamline and kind of make this process a very clear and very fast one. And then when we saw an interest in this project, we actually expanded it into sort of a semi-community engagement or participation process. So we brought planners and architects and designers from the city this case it's in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we asked them to plan in the historical form, which you can see on the left side, and in the new form, which you can see on the right side. And unsurprisingly, the results were that they could plan and be much more proactive and much more relevant when using these tools, whereas on the left side, they had to read a lot and usually were hitting a wall pretty quickly. And a couple of years later, we've expanded this work to not only look into the effects of zoning and how the regulations might appear, but actually to explore a whole set of urban performance matrices around the changes to the built environment. So you can see here things like density and proximity and diversity and many other urban performances that we were testing. And with each slight interaction of the user, you can see the users are positioning Lego bricks here, and each one of them is about 16 square meters. Tiny changes are happening to the metrics. But then when we want to change in large extent, there is this slider here that guy is sliding up, and you can see the density of that land use, in this case office small, increasing quite dramatically. So altogether, this is in a way sort of this iterative process that I was referring to. We don't look into one or two or three potential schemes. We're actually looking into endless amount of schemes in a matter of minutes or seconds, and then we can definitely understand what may be the impacts of each one of those iterations. Now, a very recent work that we're doing, which I'm quite excited about, it's pretty new and we're still in the works, is taking all of that work and bringing it into the real life. So this project is happening in Hamburg, in Germany, and you can see this site on the left side called the Grasburg site. And here you can see it from an historical map. And if your site exists already in an historical map from the 19th century, then you're in a good ballpark. That's a very important site and very close to the city center. And in the last 20 years or so, there were many, many different proposals for this site. And the German way of doing things is very much based on the public and on community engagement and participation. But they brought us into the loop when they found themselves struggling with evaluating the different designs of the site. So how do you evaluate between the Herzog de Meuron to the MVRDV to the BIG to all of those big names that come together and propose whatever they propose, and despite having very compelling visuals and very compelling renderings, it's very hard to know which are the KPIs that you need to use. How do you go beyond just evaluating visuals and renderings? So the Cityscope we built here is actually an overall of our system. From the ground up, we rebuilt the whole Cityscope platform, and I'm not going to go into the details here. But the idea is, first of all, to go to the web and to go into a decentralized system that allows us to expand it to whatever it is needed to test and evaluate in terms of the performance of that site. So just as a sneak peek, and some of you might go to that link and you can try that yourself. So it's a quickly iterative system, still very much built upon that gridded system that we have in our Cityscope platform. Very easy to model, but at the same time, allow the users to get insights in real time of anything about accessibility, mobility, agent-based simulation that you can see here, as well as other KPIs. And we do not keep it just as a web application. We also create those platforms for community engagement and participation that eventually will have the same system for evaluation. So you could take each one of those plans and eventually pull it into the site and see it over there. So really the last part, or the fourth part of that new urban process is the consensus, because so far we haven't talked about the people at all. We can do insights and predictions and transformation, and they could be wonderful for decision makers, but they could be left in those closed rooms for a bunch of selected few. If we really need to understand the public and to understand the users of those plans, we have to go into consensus. So I want to give you two examples and finish with that, in which those platforms were used for community engagement and public participation. And the first one was, again, in 2015, project we have done with the City of Boston and the Bauer Foundation, in which we were asked to help the city plan for bus rapid transit routes. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the systems. It's basically something that can replace light rail or trams in 1/10 of the cost, but still hold all the advantages of having a dedicated lane and prepayment systems, better stations, basically all the good stuff without the cost. But in the case of the City of Boston, 5 of these lanes were supposed to meet in a centralized point in Dudley Square. You can see it on the bottom right part. And usually in the City of Boston, when you try to run plans like that, that's what you get. Don't worry about this lady or the other people. They're all fine. It's just a very, very extreme protest. But that's what we were facing. We were not asked to help with the planning. We were asked to create an engagement and a participation that will remove that barrier of misunderstanding and of miscommunication. So we designed 3 platforms and we took them to this building. The 3 platforms were in 3 different scales. We realized we cannot just solve it with one city scope, and then we engaged with the regional scale, in which we looked into how a daily commute of each one of the participants looks like. So there is a place where you live, there is a place where you work, and then there are those 3rd and 4th places where you go throughout the day. Each one of the visitors would input them into the system and then see how the new bus rapid system react or do not react to their needs. And if it's not, they can then propose a change or propose some amendment. Now, it's not to say that everybody is becoming a transportation planner in the city, but it is helping us to cultivate a lot of information and crowdsource that information back to the planning board, but as well as informing the citizens about what is the outcomes and consequences of changes. So how much it might cost and how much it might derail the project and extend the amount of time until completion. The second scale was a neighborhood scale, where similarly to other Cityscope platforms, the users could actually position those movable bricks and change different stations and see how that might impact their daily commute within the neighborhood scale. And the third one, considering nobody exactly knew what BRT even is, was a simple street section that allowed people to plan the street or take an existing street actually, and then replan it with different types of BRT systems, and then also see the impacts in terms of performance and in terms of movement and other changes to the street. We learned a ton from this project, and that was a very good starting point for us to look into Cityscope as something that is beyond, compelling visuals and sort of a very compelling interactive platform, but something that can actually be used in community engagement and in participation. The gentleman you see there in the middle, he was running this station. He's a local reverend. He, the chance of me with my accent standing there in that neighborhood and trying to profess what is right and what is wrong, that's a disaster waiting to happen. But when we have local community leaders that are the ones creating that discourse, that's where the magic happens, and that's eventually what occurred here. But I want to finish with, I think, what is our most important to date Cityscope project, and for sure our most important community engagement project, which was a refugee housing project in the city of Hamburg in Germany. In June 15, we signed an agreement, a collaboration agreement with the city of Hamburg and with the Hafen City University in Hamburg. And at the beginning, we didn't really know what we're going to do. We started looking into the development of the lavish Hafen city area, this kind of a first world site with beautiful houses, and they asked us to look into that. And then there was an Olympic bid a few months after that we also took part in. But everything flipped and changed when towards end of 2015, the city realized that by the end of 2016, about 80,000 refugees from the Middle East and North Africa are about to embark on the city. These are 500 people per day. And despite the fact that Hamburg is a very strong economy, this is a devastating number to any city, any scale of city would not be able to sustain these numbers. And just to kind of give you a glimpse, these were the living conditions for those refugees when they arrived to Germany. It's better than what they had on the way to Germany, but it's nothing that you can sustain for more than 2 or 3 weeks before you lose your mind. So in November 2015, the mayor of Hamburg realizes that, through a referendum, realizes that the Olympic bid is not going to happen. And truly unattended, he appears in our newly established lab in the Hafen City University, and he tells us, guys, you have 3 months and a very short budget to come up with a different solution. And that comes from a mayor of a city of 1.5 or 6 million people. He has planning departments. He has the, needed functions in his city to accommodate those problems. But he found out that he has to think outside of the box. And this is the City Science Lab in 2016. That's everybody that was the lab at the time. We literally just hang the sign that week. We really haven't had anything. But in sort of a blitz process, in a matter of 2 months, we have copy-pasted everything we knew about city scope and collaboration, community engagement, participation, everything we learned into the city of Hamburg. And by May, we had opened the finding places, exactly 3 months in this kind of German accuracy, 3 months after we started the finding places project. And you can see the mayor here pointing, positioning the first Lego brick, and you need to be a very, I think, innovative mayor to tell your city that you're gonna solve the refugee problem using Legos, but he was this kind of a person. And today is actually the Minister of Economy in Angela Merkel's parliament. And between May and September, we held about 80 community engagement events that looked pretty much like you're seeing here. Each night we had about 20 or 30 people coming in and using our Cityscope platform. The way they use them is first to gain understanding of where refugees are currently hosted in the city, where do they reside, what are their conditions. And then they would move from that city scale into a district scale, which is one of our interactive Cityscope platforms, and would literally start playing with Legos. They would position Lego bricks in each location that they found as fitting for refugee housing. That could be a deserted parking lot or an underused warehouse or any of that. And then the system, the computational system, would react, would give a feedback whether there is a problem with that site. So you can see those orange boxes in some locations. This is, sometimes it's a zoning problem, sometimes it's land pollution, sometimes it's electricity, a kind of a power line running on top of the site. So there was kind of a feedback loop, and then that meeting would end as soon as there is a consensus within the team and within the system and the team. By the end of that, they were sitting together and, almost like a game, would look at the results of other groups from other days, and even sometimes they would say, okay, we did too little, we need to go back and find a few more places. And everybody were pretty skeptical about that process, but by the end of those 3 months, about 160 sites were found and given back by the community to the city for redevelopment for refugees. And you can see on the map on the upper right side that it's beautifully distributed around the entire city, which was one of the goals of the mayor. So don't consolidate them just in poor neighborhoods or underprivileged neighborhoods, put them everywhere in the city. And indeed, that's what effectively happened. And as you can see, if you just put tents on those 160 sites, you would already solve the problem of about 23,000 refugees. There were changes to the current of refugees, the amount of refugees arriving to the city, so we didn't have to use all of those sites eventually. But that was, I think, more than anything, kind of a proof of concept, if you want, that if you change the system, if you change the process, you can go from the usual NIMBYism to the yes, we can. You can move people's opinion if you change the conversation, not necessarily if you change the results. And this project is currently being cited worldwide, and it's becoming recently a toolkit in the European Commission. Actually, we're currently developing the next phase for this tool to be sort of a generic tool for refugee housing all over the world. And I think that's a good example for the usage of these platforms. So lastly, as Stephen mentioned at the beginning, we're building a network. The idea is to leave MIT, leave our lab, go places as soon as we can go places, and deploy those platforms and use them in various use cases. The idea is that the tools are very similar from one place to another, but the questions are very, very dynamic and very open. And this is very much what we're trying to do with our Cityscopes. Inject them into those places, build them in an open source, in an open manner with those local communities, and then let them use them for their own purposes. So my last slide, we started with asking what smart cities are. So I think by now you realize that's not at least my interest. Maybe if you take something from this talk, we can start thinking about moving from smart cities to street knowledge. Thinking from bottom up, thinking from below, from the street experience, from how we live in the city, for how we behave in the city, and then let technology support that, but not replace any of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. That's super cool. I love your work. I love what's going on over there. I don't know, maybe I'll start with a few questions just because I always have some questions maybe about method, process, but then we have lots of people coming in. Your role in all of this is you're one of many, right? I mean, there seem to be several of you that all seem to be working as part of this larger organization managed at MIT. Now you're saying you guys are also exploring or pushing beyond yourselves into other communities. Are you teaming up with local communities to do that? Is it other university based? Or are you like setting up all new infrastructures? And where's the funding for all that coming from?
Used to come from.
Used to come from, right.
Everything is before March. So the idea behind the City Science Network, and as you mentioned, we're a big team, and we're led by Kent Larson, who is running this group, is to, again, move away from the common course of developing things within MIT, within the lab, and just, keep them there, maybe publish a paper, and then just, leave them to rest. The idea is to take the research and find collaborators in other places in the world that might make good use of that research in ways that we wouldn't imagine otherwise. And the way we usually do it, and of course each use case is very different, is first find a local liaison that is usually a university. It's not necessarily a university, but I think in the case of Andorra, it's not a university, it's a small research institute there. But in Hamburg, it is a university. In Aalto, in Helsinki, it's also a university. And the idea there is that they will be our counterparts in terms of building the tools and kind of doing the research. Beyond that, there is always a third node to that triangle, which is usually the city or the government, who can, first of all, financially support that, but also create the necessary connections to the industry and to other research institutes that will expand that work beyond. So again, I think the use case of Hamburg is pretty good to explain that we have the university, we have the city, but then the city opens doors with other companies and with other institutes, and that sort of expands. And maybe just to close on that question, when we established the City Science Lab in Hamburg in 2015, again, there was maybe 2 or 3 people in the team. There are now near 40 researchers there, and at least in terms of European budgets, they are scoring very, very high. They just scored a few UN grants, and they're building their own private network. So it's become kind of a network of networks now. And we are, standing as bystanders. This is a beautiful thing to see. And that's very much the idea. It's not us controlling them or them controlling us. It's just us spreading the thing, and that kind of spreads itself.
So now that I don't know, how far are you along in your PhD?
Don't ask this question. It's a forbidden
basically
question.
Done, right? You're basically done. I know people from MIT who've gone on to, I guess, like Terraform and people of that nature who are part of that Brooklyn group too. There's a whole network of you that guys go into the world and spread the knowledge, I suppose, and invent your own systems. Does MIT have patent rights? I mean, maybe, obviously you're using Legos, but it's just Legos with projection and algorithms, right? That are basically modeled into lights that are projected onto imagery. Can you start your own organization? Can you change the methods and the tools? Like what is the protocols or the,
So that's probably another hour of conversation, but yes, they're just Legos, projections, and algorithms. And I think that the just is a good point. We took, at least my team, the Cityscope team, we took a conscious decision a few years ago to first of all open source all of our work. So there is nothing proprietary in anything that we do. There might be in other use cases in the lab. I'm not talking for the entire City Science Lab, or of course not to the entire Media Lab, but we decided that as part of that idea of building a network and building a resilient network that can build itself, this has to be an open source effort, and this has to be created by many and not by few. And the interesting thing is that as soon as we started doing that, the complexity level actually became higher. Meaning we could build more complex things as soon as there is a network of, anything from just getting the feedback to helping us with the development. And as you said, I mean, we realized that because the core of, projecting information using Legos and interacting it's not magical. I mean, it might look magical, but there is no magic behind that in terms of technology. I think the magic comes from what I call the Cityscope process, which is this whole slew of behaviors and of activities that starts with data gathering at one point, into building a community engagement process, into building the tools, into managing the tools, into producing the results. All of that is, I think, what we call Cityscope. And the cherry on the top eventually is Legos with lights. But I guess this process is what we really think of as kind of the thing we want to see. And one last thing I would say is that every once in a while I get an email saying, hey, we built a Cityscope. Would you like to come and see what we have done? Which is the best thing in the world for us, because last year I visited Budapest, and they just had to set up a room in the city center with a Cityscope, and they had the whole system running, and it was incredible to see. And for us, that's exactly what we're hoping. The tools should not be only by us and only deployed by us. I think the maybe selling point we might bring into the table is that we are quite experienced with that entire process and with complex processes of Cityscope, and therefore we can maybe contribute that.
Great. I probably have more questions, but I'm going to open it up. Does anyone here in front in the panel have a question? Just unmute yourselves and ask.
I have a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, go ahead as we go.
Okay, thanks, Zane. Thanks again, Ariel, for the lecture. I was really impressed with all your work and whoever makes the animations on your team. I was hoping to ask about, the audience that you're trying to present this information to. Could you just talk about, what audience are you hoping to see all this data? And could you talk about the groups, whether it be planners, developers, architects, citizens that you think can create like big change when it comes to like cities?
I think it's a great question. we have to curate for everyone with these tools, and that's a very big effort that we do. I think that for you guys, you know, a bunch of designers, of experts in your fields, some of those things might even look simplistic to you to a degree, but that's by design, because we realize, and sometimes I think we forget, that the general public, and by general public I also mean decision makers, you know, the mayor himself, their ability, their capacity to understand complex behaviors in urban environment is limited. And we therefore have to create systems that are curating everyone. And, you know, as you saw in our Cityscope platform, the idea is that you literally have everyone around the same platform, and they should all be on a level plane in terms of the quality of their conversation and their understanding of what's going on there. So there is a very big effort in every one of the platforms you've seen there to simplify, not, you know, not oversimplify, but simplify it to the point where it's accessible and that the general user base could use it. There are cases where we curate, you know, more planners or architects, or I saw the German use case of the competition that might be more professionally oriented, so you can show more complex information. But still, even then, if you want things to be snappy and quick and clear, those, you know, fancy, super complex diagrams we know as architects to do, it takes time to understand, and we want to move away from that.
I don't know, Zane, you want to ask your question, and then we'll have Emily. Hi,
Okay, awesome. So Ariel, thank you so much for your time. I know it's getting late over there on the East Coast, so thank you for that amazing lecture. I guess my question kind of builds from the talk of the automobile and how that changed the dynamic of the walkable city, and that kind of time frame of getting place to place from the city center. And you did touch upon how that has progressed now, and how we kind of are seeing a mixture of using a car but still being in these highly dense living situations. So I guess my question really is, when it comes to walking, do you think that is the new direction that we're maybe going to return to? And could it maybe occur on a scale like masses of people having cars now, and more cars being on the roads in the US than like people? So do you think it's possible that, or even right, that walking really takes the stage again, / biking just these light means of travel?
Well, I guess, you know, I think we need to differentiate what is possible and what we need to aspire to. So first of all, if we do aspire to that direction, if you know, this great team goes out to the market and become, you know, the next generation of planners or architects or designers, if this is the tone that you're setting in your projects, and you don't just accept the transportation engineers' rules about 1.75 cars per apartment or whatever it is that they propose or impose on your project, these are the starting points for a change. It will not emerge from, you know, some grand gesture that somebody will, you know, wake up and make at a certain point. It has to come from an understanding that this is something we need to aspire to, and we need to think about in terms of changing. And I want to say, maybe we didn't talk about the pandemic, which is wonderful. I'm very happy to have 2 hours without speaking about Corona, but there is this, you know, if you go on Twitter or you go on the discourse of urbanists now in the context of the Corona, everybody's cheering up about our, you know, cleaned up cities, and every street is walkable and it's wonderful, and, you know, this whole celebration of how the city has changed so quickly. And I'm very skeptic about that notion, because the same way that we've seen this dramatic shift in the past few weeks, the same way it might flip as soon as we are, you know, reopening and going back to real life. And we might see, you know, we already see, I mean, I've read a few articles talking about increase in selling cars, increase in moving to the suburbs, discussions about, you know, going out of the city again. So again, I think our role as designers and planners is to set the tone, is to say what we think is right and how we think the city should eventually be developed. Whether it will go this direction, you know, a few years ago, there was this moment where, for the first time in history, there were less cars bought than before. I think it was 2015 or something like that. And then it held for about 2.5 years and went back again. But there was a moment there. There was a whole discourse around cities that kind of shifted the notion, and many millennials suddenly moved into city centers and kind of dropped the cars, and there was a change. So I think we definitely can do that, and I think we definitely can aspire to that direction. I think it's all about the course we're setting.
Emily?
I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Hi,
That does,
Ariel.
thank you.
Hello, my name is Emily Huang, and I am actually an MIT alum. I have an MArch from 1991. Thank you very much for your presentation. I am very intrigued by what you did for the city of Hamburg. I live in San Francisco. We have a horrific homeless problem. Do you think, I'm sure you've thought about this, do you think a similar strategy can be applied to major American cities? And if so, do you want to come and help us in San Francisco?
Short, yes and yes. Look, I think that, you know, there was something very unique in our experience in Hamburg, which I would love to replicate here to the United States or anywhere else in the world. And it was the openness by the local government. The doors that were opened by the mayor and by the local decision makers there were the ones that helped us, you know, approach, I think we approached 1.2 million people in the city to cultivate those who actually eventually came to those community engagement meetings. We didn't, you know, we didn't invite everyone. We had to select, and that was a very long selection process, and we needed to find the local leaders, and there was a lot of efforts in the background before we got to the fancy Legos and the shiny lights. So if we find, you know, similar local government somewhere here in the United States or, you know, anywhere else in the world, we would love to do that. We found it in Boston. That was the Boston BRT project. Again, a lot of effort, a lot of push by the local government here, but I think this is a very important part of the process. Beyond that, absolutely, we would love to explore these opportunities.
Thank you very much. I think San Francisco, of all American cities, might be somewhere that would be willing to try. If I may connect with you later, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Nice to hear you. Liam, why don't you ask your question, because it kind of comes right off of that one.
Yeah, funnily enough, it's also about the Bay Area. So I grew up in Berkeley, and I kind of been aware of their urban displacement project, where they've been overlaying some like historical redlining data with current maps of gentrification in the Bay Area and trying to like find a correlation. So what you've shown us so far has been some unbelievable like looks into the future of cities with simulating changes. So I'm wondering if you've thought about using similar methods to analyze the past and kind of understanding where we came from in that way.
Yeah, so not me personally, but I can connect you or actually send a few links. One of my PhD advisors, Professor Esteban Muro, which physically sits very close to me in the lab, is doing incredible work on the field of mapping what he called the Atlas of Inequality, which is a very sophisticated methodology by which they use historical data as well as current telecom data and other movement and behavioral data that they gather, and they fuse them together in a way that allows you to start and understand, I think similarly with what you're kind of imagining, which areas are more segregated, which areas are less, are more kind of underprivileged. And I'm not familiar with the project you mentioned, but I think that the approach they're taking, which is interesting, is about the fact that what we might perceive as neighborhoods which are underprivileged are not just bounded by their sort of, you know, zoning redlinings or kind of statutory lines that surrounds them in the maps. In fact, this inequality spreads when you go to work, when you go to your, third places, when you visit friends the other side of town. And this whole process is something that at least up until 5-10 years ago, you wouldn't be able to map, at least in a higher resolution. And now they're capable of doing that. So I would suggest you take a look into that work. Maybe that's something that could trigger your interest.
Thanks very much.
Sure.
Sydney, you want to jump with your question?
Yeah, thank you again, Ariel, for sharing your lecture. I've been following Cityscope for a while, and I've always been wondering, as a community activist and also representing the Bay Area, specifically Oakland, I'm thinking a lot about how does this model simulation consider more marginalized user populations? As you mentioned, low income, homelessness, refugees, the undocumented. And like this urban landscape is also very different for American cities. So I guess I'm wondering, just a few things that pop up is like, how could this model simulation be more, or at least use more community city science in the sense that it's more open source, perhaps providing toolkits for community activists or community groups that have already been doing the work locally, but kind of lack that technical knowledge. And again, usually there are still more marginalized narratives that are not part of this urban design process.
It's a wonderful question. I want to answer that in sort of two aspects. One is something that I think previously I mentioned to Stephen, which is first and foremost, all of our development is open source. So both the hardware and the software is out there for people to use as much as they need. And I do understand that there is still a technical gap between taking a software and then deploying it and using it properly. So a big effort, and at least kind of what I'm working on almost on a daily basis now, is to move that platform into the web and into sort of an easy to use environment in which you wouldn't even need to deploy complex code or kind of use more sophisticated tools, but really go on a website, have a baseline kind of a bare bones system that you can start play with, and then build from there. That's in the technical side of things, and this is a big effort me and my team are doing at the moment. From the side of, I think more generally, how we approach underprivileged communities. In the case of Boston with the BRT project, that was a very, very big lesson we have learned. And it took us some time to understand that we should not be there in the room, as I mentioned. We should have the local leaders and the local community both running the tools and visiting and using them in part of that community engagement. The actual facility that we used was in the center of neighborhood. It wasn't, at MIT. They didn't come to MIT. We went there and we deployed it over there and we left it there for a few weeks. And same goes with the case of Hamburg. It was operated by local members of the public, and of course all the participants were local. The one thing that we have missed in Hamburg was the actual refugee population itself, and that was an outcome of their situation at the time. If you're familiar with the status of refugees in Europe, at least in the first years when they arrive, there is a tremendous fear from anything that smells of authority, given the places that they come from. So they use burner phones, and they don't have addresses, and they change their numbers, and it's very, very hard to connect them and to track them and to bring them, especially for something that seems very official and very government oriented. So we couldn't have them in those meetings. But for the current process and the current development of these tools, we do have a lot of effort on bringing them and actually finding ways to communicate them. It goes down all the way to the technical text message we can send to refugees that just arrived to the city so they can use some of these platforms for their need. And the last thing I would say about that is that in the past year and a half, we started exploring sort of the global south, and we established a lab in Guadalajara, in Mexico, and in Quito and some other places. And this will be really the testing point for all of what you, I think, mentioned, how we move away from sort of more first world deployments of Cityscope to kind of, the real world where it's really needed. So we're excited about that step.
So I kind of want to ask a question that kind of came up when you started discussing zoning. This probably comes from experience trying to and dealing with planning departments and codes in terms of design, both in LA and San Francisco. And what's kind of interesting to me in your questions and the way in which you're designing this is whenever you, and data, and what I'm really kind of questioned and wondering is, it's always interpretive. So all these zones, all these codes, all this data information that you're plugging into a machine that then somehow we can put our little building down, it can tell me, yeah, it can't be that high. But there are 40 different rules of exceptions that allow me to be that high if I trade off this, do that, do this, do this, do this, or don't do this. Or I communicate with a bunch of people with some, or plan through a conditional use policy, or alter or change the zoning, which I'm actually able to do, like they did with ADUs, right? They did a lot of interesting sort of work that seems to me very hard to embed in a color and light data mapping show. Although you want to. It's kind of like your question, like you want to be able to show that I can put a Herzog building here, or I can put a Geary building, which one is going to perform more effectively for certain criteria, you know, as opposed to just pure visuals. But it seems a lot will in the end be analytical, data analysis, and also interpretive. I'm wondering who does that aspect of the interpretation.
Well, maybe first thing about the zoning. So congrats, you found the hidden purpose of that project. The idea was to show it's literally impossible to understand. And it's borderline useless to try with the current tools, or at least with the current way the zoning is constructed for that use case. I mentioned I spent months to, reading through the rules and trying to kind of parse them, and I still failed. And of course, an algorithm would not be able to do that. But that was, again, when we showed that to the city of Cambridge, of course, not everything changed within a day. That's not a Hollywood movie, but it sort of started a conversation around that exact problem. We don't understand our own city. We have parcels that we might live next to, that we might, walk by every day on the way to work, and they might have rights that none of us is aware of. And tomorrow morning there might be a monstrous building just next to us, because these rules are completely malleable and very hard to comprehend. So that was a big part of that work. I still do think that, at least in the baseline, exposing what is, before you start changing the rules and sort of working through for the legal system to find the loopholes, in the baseline, this is a valuable tool to be used. We actually took a page from a similar project that happened in Switzerland. And in Switzerland, when they build anything above a certain height, especially in the German side of Switzerland, they are obliged to build a physical envelope of the zoning. So they literally build those three-dimensional huge scaffoldings that imitate the zoning change, so everybody in the city can see that when they pass by. This is Switzerland. They have enough money and resources to do those things, but in the real world, we don't have these tools. And we wanted to sort of try and build something similar to that, show how the zoning are, what would a change mean, and how that will react. In the context of sort of the German project, which is not about zoning, that's where we actually look more into KPIs and kind of performance of the design. I think the idea is that alongside the rendering panels and 3D models that the jurors are going to face anyway, how do you try and evaluate, for example, the impact of accessibility of that project on the entire city? How do you value the impact of noise or on water or many other sort of kind of sometimes mundane layers of information, but nevertheless very necessary ones? And these do not appear in those documents. So the idea is not, to completely replace what a regular competition phase would be, but to augment it with that data that otherwise would not exist. And hopefully will open up some conversations that otherwise would not happen as well. I don't know if that's answering the question.
Helpful. Edward, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you so much. This has been an amazing talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm a recent computer science major graduate who's like worked for a local government innovation team. And this is more of a question on career advice. Are there any places you would recommend for a new graduate to get involved in this urban innovation research? This is like amazing work. So cool.
Thank you. Well, this is being recorded, so you know, maybe a few weeks ago I would say Sidewalk Labs. Now I'm not sure anymore. But you know, I guess let's put it that way. You're not going to get the salary you might get on a Google if you go to work for the city, but this is probably where you're going to have the most impact. So at least in the case of Boston, we have an amazing team called the New Urban Mechanics Office, a wonderful group of people that actually worked with us on that BRT project you've seen before. And that's what they do on a daily basis. They basically merge planners, architects, computer scientists, other thinkers and innovators to come up with new solutions for the city. So I think, I'm sure that the Bay Area and the West Coast have similar initiatives and places to work. I can't say I know too much about the industry. I think it's a very new kind of profession, this whole city science, urban data science. There are several companies, usually mapping companies, that are doing that. There are some, I think, you know, portions of bigger companies. I think Uber had a section that was dedicated to this work, as well as some other companies. But I think, you know, eventually at the end of the day, it boils down to what you really want to do. I think that within those companies, you're serving maybe their goal, and so a different goal that from what you might imagine as, you know, a contributor to urbanism and a contributor to the built environment. Within cities, again, neglecting the salary part, I think you might find yourself contributing much more to the creation of these new platforms.
Thank you so much.
Cool. Do we have any more questions that I'm not aware of? So anybody here in the panel have a question? Are we good? I guess the only thing I would probably...
We lost Steven.
You lost me? No, I'm here. Ah. Great. Hello? Ah.
Steven, I think your image is frozen.
But I'm hearing you now, so it must be working. Are we working? Can you hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. No?
I can barely hear you.
You can barely hear me? It's like I'm one of those voices that are kind of coming and going, like on the olden days. Anyway, I can't do it.
I can take another question.
I don't know. Am I back?
Yes, you're back now.
Yeah.
So sorry. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, this is the fun and games of being online. So Ariel, hey, you know, the only thing I was just going to add is we're going to launch a little MS ARC program here in LA. Well, it is part of our Cal Poly San Luis Obispo campus program that we're going to turn into an urban design program here in LA. And I've always been interested in your work. I'm also interested in what we're going to see next week, City Lab's doing. Anyway, so we have goals to kind of work in this world with you. So I don't know, we'll continue the conversation. Can you guys not hear me?
We lost you at MS.
It's all good. All right, well, thank you, Ariel. All great. Thank you. Everyone have a great evening. Sleep well. And hopefully internet will be on our side next time. Ciao.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Steven. Thank you, everybody.
Ciao.
Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
Ariel.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Steven.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.